The Brothers Karamazov, Book 7, A Judicial Error, a Treatise. Yes, a treatise on Smerdyakov, page 901. Oh, I had to actually Google that, man. I don't know how to say that. In the first place, whence did the possibility of such a suspicion arise? Ippolit Kirillovich began, taking this question as his starting point. The first person to cry out that Smerdyakov had committed the murder was the defendant at the moment of his arrest. Yet from the very first cry of his right to this very moment of the trial, he has not brought forward one piece of factual evidence to support his accusation. Not only that, but he has not brought forward so much as even a hint of such evidence that would in any way conform with human sense. His accusation had subsequently been confirmed by only three persons: the two brothers of the defendant and Miss Svetlova. But the defendant's elder brother declared his suspicion only today, in a state of illness, in a fit of self-defense, self-evident delirium, and nervous fever, while earlier, throughout the whole 2 months, a fact of which we are positively informed, he totally shared the conviction concerning his brother's guilt, and did not even seek to oppose the idea. We shall, however, treat of this separately later. After this younger brother of the defendant declared to us just now that he has no factual evidence whatsoever to support his notion concerning the guilt of Smerdyakov, not even the slightest, but finds grounds for his conclusion merely in the words of the defendant and the expression of his face, yes, the colossal demonstration of fact was twice pronounced just now by his brother. As for Miss Svetlova, she expressed herself in perhaps even more colossal manner. Whatever the defendant tells you, please believe it. He is not the kind of man to tell a lie. There is all the factual proof concerning the guilt of Smerdyakov we have obtained from these three persons, who have all too great an interest in the fate of the defendant. And yet, in spite of this accusation that Smerdyakov is guilty, he persisted and is maintained, even now. Can that be believed? Can that be imagined? At this point, Ippolit Kirillovich deemed it necessary to trace in brief outline the character of the deceased Smerdyakov, who cut short his own life in a fit of morbid delirium and insanity. He presented him as a weak-minded, with an embryo of some dim progressive education, unbalanced by philosophical ideas that were beyond the strength of his intelligence, and frightened by certain contemporary theories concerning duty and responsibility, in which he had been generously instructed from a practical point of view by the reckless existence of his deceased baron, and possibly also father, Fyodor Pavlovich, and from a theoretical one, by various strange philosophical conversations with his baron's elder son, Ivan Fyodorovich, who had willingly permitted himself this diversion, doubtless from tedium or a need for mockery that had found no better application. He himself described to me his mental condition during the last day of his sojourn in the house of his baron, Ippolit Kirillovich elucidated. But others, too, have testified to the same thing. The defendant himself, his brother, and even the manservant Grigory, that is to say, all those who might be expected to have known him most intimately. In addition to his being dispirited by the falling sickness, Smerdyakov was cowardly as a hen. He fell at my feet and kissed them, the defendant informed us, at a moment when he had not yet apprised a certain disadvantage to himself in those words. Excuse me. He is a hen with the falling sickness, was the way he expressed it in his own characteristic language. And yet he it is whom the defendant, as he himself has testified, selects as his trusted agent, bullying him so badly that the latter agrees, at last, to serve as his spy and message carrier. In this capacity of domestic snoop, he betrays his baron, informs the defendant both of the existence of the envelope containing the money and of the signals, by means of which it is possible to gain access to the baron's chambers. And how could he not so inform? His honor was going to kill me, sir. I could see plain as daylight he was going to kill me, sir, he said at the preliminary investigation, positively shaking and trembling before us, in spite of the fact that the tormentor who had bullied him was already under arrest, at the time and could no longer come and punish him. His Honor suspected me every moment, sir, and I, in fear and trembling, just in order to assuage his wrath, made haste to communicate to him all the different secrets, sir, in order thereby that he could see my innocence before him and let me go alive in peace, sir. Here are his own words. I noted them down and committed them to memory. Whenever he used to shout at me, I just fell on my knees before his Honor. Being by his nature a highly honest young man and entering thereby into the confidence of his baron, who has discerned in him this honesty, when the lad had returned to him the money he had lost, the unhappy Smerdyakov was, one must suppose, horribly racked by remorse at having betrayed his baron, whom he loved as his benefactor. Those who suffer badly from the falling sickness invariably have, according to the testimony of the deepest psychiatrists, a tendency towards constant and, of course, morbid self-accusation. They torment themselves with their own guilt for something and in someone's regard, torment themselves with gnawing of conscience, frequently, even without any foundation, exaggerate and even dream up various culpabilities and crimes which they impute to themselves. Sounds a bit like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. And now here we have a case where a subject of this type really does become guilty and criminally involved, from fear and bullying. Moreover, he had a premonition that because of circumstances that are forming themselves before his eyes, something unpleasant may ensue. When Fyodor Pavlovich's elder son, Ivan Fyodorovich, traveled away to Moscow just before the catastrophe, Smerdyakov implored him to remain, not daring, however, in keeping with his cowardly habit, to air all his misgivings to him in a clear and categorical form. He merely made do with hints, but the hints were not taken. It should be observed that in Ivan Fyodorovich he saw, as it were, a protection, a guarantee that while the latter remained at home, no trouble would take place. Remember the expression contained in Dmitri Karamazov's drunken letter. I will kill the old man if only Ivan has gone away. In other words, Ivan Fyodorovich's presence in the house appeared to all as a kind of guarantee of quiet and order in the house. And lo, now he actually does go away, and Smerdyakov at once, no more than an hour after the departure of the young baron, falls down in a fit of the falling sickness. But that is perfectly natural. Here it needs to be mentioned that during the final days, dispirited by fears and by a kind of despair, Smerdyakov had a particular sense of possible approach of his fits, of the falling sickness, which had invariably afflicted him before at moments of moral tension and shock. The day and the hour of these fits is, of course, impossible to predict, but all the epileptics are able to sense beforehand within themselves a disposition towards them. Medicine tells us so. And lo, no sooner does Ivan Fyodorovich leave the threshold than Smerdyakov, influenced by the effects of his, so to speak, orphaned and defenseless state, goes down to the cellar on a matter of household business, descends the staircase and thinks, am I or am I not about to have a fit? And what if it comes right now? And lo, precisely because of this mood, this state of suspicion, these questions, he is seized by the laryngeal, Laryngeal, I don't know what that means, spasm, by which the falling sickness is invariably preceded. And down he flies headlong, bereft of consciousness, to the floor of the cellar. This is actually a really good Cliff Note version of what happened so far. So it's a pretty cool section to read, even though you might not be interested in the whole book. So yeah, I'm glad I'm reading this out. Back to the book, as Jocko would say. And here, in the most natural fortuity, some contrive to detect a suspicion, a sign, a hint that his illness was purposely feigned. But if that were so, then there at once appears the question, why? On what calculation, with what goal? Never mind medicine, now it is science, they say, that is wrong, science that is in error. The doctors have been unable to distinguish truth from feigning. Let that be so, let it be so. But then answer me one question. For what reason should he feign? Possibly so as, having schemed the murder to draw to himself by means of the fit, he had severed the attention of those in the house in advance, and as quickly as possible? You see, gentlemen of the jury, There were or had been in the house of Fyodor Pavlovitch upon the night of the crime 5 people. In the first place, Fyodor Pavlovitch himself, but he did not kill himself, that is clear. In the second, his manservant, Grigory, but then he himself was very nearly killed. In the third, Grigory's wife, the serving maid Marfa Ignatyevna. But to imagine her as the murderess of her baron is simply shameful. There remain, therefore, 2 people in view, the defendant and Smerdyakov. But as the defendant assures us that he is not the murderer, then consequently it must have been Smerdyakov. There is no other alternative, for no one else can be found. No other murderer may be selected. Here, therefore, is the origin of this cunning and colossal accusation against the unhappy idiot who yesterday did away with himself. It lies in one simple fact, namely that there is no other candidate. Given the existence of a mere shadow, a mere suspicion of another, of some 6th person, I am convinced that even the defendant himself would be ashamed to point to Smerdyakov, but would point to that 6th person to accuse Smerdyakov of this murder is a total absurdity. Gentlemen, let us abandon psychology, let us abandon medicine, let us abandon even logic itself, and let us turn merely to the evidence alone, and let us see what the evidence tells us. Smerdyakov committed the murder, but how? Alone or in association with the defendant? Let us initially examine the first possibility, that is to say, that Smerdyakov planned and committed the murder alone. Well, that's a very good structure. I can totally follow it. Okay, back to the book. Of course, if he did it, then surely he must have done it for some purpose, for some gain, possessing, however, not a shadow of the motives for the murder such as those possessed by the defendant, that is to say, hatred, jealousy, etc., etc. It is beyond doubt that Smerdyakov could have committed it only for the sake of money, in order to appropriate that same 3,000 he himself had seen in his baron put away in the envelope. And so, having schemed the murder, he communicates in advance to another person, and moreover, a person in the highest degree interested, namely the defendant, all the details concerning the money and the signals, the location of the envelope, the precise nature of the inscription upon it, the material with which it was tied, and above all, communicates to him those signals, by means of which one may pass into the baron's chambers. Well, does he do this simply in order to give himself away, or in order to provide a rival for himself, one who himself may wish to gain entrance and acquire the envelope? Ah, yes, I will be told, but after all he imparted the information out of fear. But how can that be? The man who did not blink at devising such a fearless, brutal scheme and then executing it, communicates information which he alone in all the world is privy to, and which had he but kept silent about it, would never have been guessed by anyone in all the world. Oh, I gotta decrease my flow now. Alright, here we go. No. However cowardly the man may have been, he had devised a scheme like that, then on no account would have told anyone at least about the envelope and the signals, for that would have meant to give himself away in advance. Had he been absolutely forced to impart information, he would have devised something on purpose, concocted some fib or another, but about that he would have remained silent. On the contrary, I say again, had he kept silent only about the money, but then committed the murder and appropriated the money, no one in all the world would have accused him, at any rate, of murder for the sake of robbery. For after all, no one but he had sinned that money. No one but he knew of its existence in the house. Even were he to be accused, people would be bound to think that he had committed the murder from some other motive. But as no one had ever observed any such motives in him prior to the deed, and as everyone had, on the contrary, perceived that he was liked by his baron, honored with his baron's confidence, then of course he would be the last to receive suspicion, and suspicion would fall first and foremost upon such a one as had possessed those motives. One who had himself shouted that he possessed those motives, who had not concealed them, had revealed them to everyone. In a word, suspicion would fall upon the murdered man's son, Dmitri Fyodorovich. Smerdyakov would murder and rob, and the son would be accused of it. After all, that would of course be to Smerdyakov's advantage as a murderer, would it not? Well, and so now it is this son Dmitri that Smerdyakov having laid his scheme of murder, communicates in advance the information concerning the money, the envelope, and the signals. How logical it is. How plain. Right, gotta stop briefly here and I'll be back to read a bit more. Alright, back to the book. I had a San Miguel. I think I can read better now. I just started then. Not a good sign. Alright, page 906. Starting from where I left off. I think that's how you say it, right? Left off. Anyhow. There arrives the day of the murder planned by Smerdyakov, and lo, now he flies clean off his feet, having feigned the whole thing, in a fit of falling sickness. And why? Well, of course, so that in the first place, the manservant, Grigory, planning to treat his injuries and perceiving that there was no one at all to guard their house, might perhaps put off his treatment and settle down on watch himself. In the second place, of course, so that the Baron himself, perceiving that there was no one on watch, and in fearful apprehension, which he did not conceal, that his son might arrive, would redouble his mistrust and caution. Finally and principally, of course, so that he, Smerdyakov, being incapacitated by the fit, would at once be carried from the kitchen, where he invariably passed the night separate from all the rest and where he had his own special entry and exit, at the other end of the outbuilding, to Grigory's little room, which Grigory and his wife occupied behind the partition, 3 paces from their own bed, as had always happened, from time immemorial. No the in between. As soon as he was incapacitated by the falling sickness, at the disposition of the Baron and the compassionate Marfa Ignatyevna. There, as he lay behind the partition, in order to appear more truly ill, he would most probably, of course, begin to groan, that is, keep waking them up all night, as was indeed the case according to the testimony of Grigory and his wife. And all this in order to be able to arise the more conveniently and then slay the Baron. But it will be said to me, perhaps, he feigned his fit for the very purpose of evading suspicion as one who was ill, and communicated the information concerning the money and the signals to the defendant for the very purpose of luring him so that he would come and commit the murder. And when the latter, do you see, having committed the murder, left and carried off the money, possibly making a noise and a commotion while doing so, arousing witnesses from slumber, then, you see, Smerdyakov too would arise and go. And what would he go in order to do? He would go for the very purpose of murdering the Baron a second time, and the second time carrying off the money that had already been carried off. Gentlemen, you laugh. I myself am embarrassed to make such suppositions. Yet, if you will credit it, it is this very thing that the defendant asserts is so. What he says is that after he had already left the house, having brought Grigory down and alarmed the entire neighborhood, he rose, went, murdered, and robbed. I say nothing of how Smerdyakov could have worked all this out in advance and predicted it all as though on his fingertips. That is to say, the angry and enraged son would arrive solely in order to cast a deferential glance in through the window and, though in possession of the signals, beat a retreat, leaving him, Smerdyakov, all the spoils. Gentlemen, I earnestly ask you this question. At what moment did Smerdyakov commit his crime? Please point out that moment. For without it, there can be no indictment. It reads indictment, but you say indictment, right? I guess. Alright, back to the book. But you may say, perhaps, the falling sickness was genuine. The sick man suddenly regained consciousness, heard a shout, and went outside. Well, and what of it? Did he take a look and say to himself, why do I not go and kill the Baron? But how could he have discovered what was taking place? For, after all, he had until the moment been lying unconscious. And in any case, gentlemen, there is a limit to fantasies. Yes, sir, men of astuteness will say. Don't know what the hell that means. But what if the two were in complicity? And what if they both committed the murder together and divided the cash? What then? Yes, indeed, that is a suspicion of major importance, and for a start there is colossal evidence to support it. One of the accomplices commits the murder and take all the toil and trouble upon himself, while the other does nothing at all, feigning the falling sickness, for the very purpose of arousing suspicion in everyone beforehand, uneasiness in the Baron, uneasiness in Grigory. One wonders what motives the two accomplices would have had for dreaming up such a crazy plan as this. I don't know how you say accomplices, like the plural of accomplice, but I guess it's accomplices. I'll be sure to correct it if it's wrong in the next segment. Anyhow, back to the book. But it may be better that there was no active complicity at all on the part of Smerdyakov, but rather, so to speak, one that was passive and born of long suffering. Perhaps the cowed Smerdyakov merely agreed not to oppose the murder, and sensing that he would in the end be accused of having let his baron be murdered, of having failed to shout out or to oppose the deed, secured in advance from Dmitri Karamazov permission to spend that interval of time as though he were in the falling sickness. And you can go and murder as you please, but my izba has walls. But if that were the case, then, as this falling sickness must surely cause a flurry of alarm within the house, foreseeing this, Dmitri Karamazov would on no account agree to such an understanding. But I concede, let it be the case that he did agree. After all, even the result would be that Dmitri Karamazov was the murderer, the outright murderer and instigator, and Smerdyakov only a passive accomplice, and not even an accomplice, but only someone who connived, C-O-N-N-I-V-E-D, I don't know how to say that, out of fear and against his will, something which, after all, the process of the law would be bound to perceive, and yet, lo, what do we see? As soon as the defendant is arrested, he instantly unloads all the guilt onto Smerdyakov and accuses him alone. Not of complicity with him does he accuse him, but rather him alone. He did it, that's a bit tautological, man, just get to the point. He did it on his own, he says. He committed the murder and the robbery. It is the work of his hands. But what kind of accomplices are they who at once begin to lay the blame upon each other? And in any case, that never occurs. And observe what a risk Karamazov is taking. He is the principal murderer, while the other is not. The other has merely connived and lain behind the partition, and now he unloads all the guilt onto the recumbent man. But after all, the other, the recumbent one, might grow angry, and out of a mere sense of self-preservation, waste no time in declaring the genuine truth, that both had worked in complicity, but that he had not committed the murder, merely allowing it and connived at it because he was afraid. After all, he, Smerdyakov, might realize that the law would not at once perceive the degree of his culpability, and consequently he might also calculate that if he were to receive punishment, then it would be of an incomparably lesser nature than that meted out to the other, the principal murderer, who wished to unload all the guilt onto him. But then he would perforce, force? It's weird, have made a confession. This, however, we did not see. Smerdyakov never even mentioned any complicity, though the murderer unequivocally accused him and all the time kept pointing to him as the sole murderer. Not only that, Smerdyakov even disclosed to the investigation that it had been he himself who had communicated to the defendant the information concerning the envelope of money and the signals, and that had it not been for him, the other would have discovered anything. Had he really been acting in complicity and been guilty? Would he have given this information so lightly to the investigation? That is to say, that all of this he had himself imparted to the defendant. On the contrary, he would have begun to deny it, and would be bound to distort the evidence and reduce its import. But he did neither. Only one who was innocent, who was not afraid that he would be accused of complicity, could have done as he did. And then, in a fit of morbid melancholy, I think I know this word, but I can't say it, melancholy, caused by his falling sickness, and by the whole of this catastrophe that had burst upon him yesterday, he hanged himself. Doing so, he left a note, written in curious style. I exterminate myself by my own will and inclination, in order to blame no one. Well, why did he not simply add to the note, the murderer is I, and not Karamazov? But this he did not do. Did he even the conscience for the one but not the other? And then what happens? Earlier today, money was brought to the court, 3,000 rubles, the very same money, it was said, that was contained in the very same envelope that now lies on the table of material and which I received yesterday from Smerdyakov. So I think at this point he's just mocking Ivan. Okay, back to the book. But you yourselves, gentlemen of the jury, remember that melancholy scene of earlier today. I need to make sure I know how to say this word. Melancholy. I shall not recapitulate the details, but shall nevertheless permit myself to make just 2 or 3 observations, selecting them from among the least significant, for the very reason that they are insignificant, and so will not occur to everyone and be forgotten. In the first place, and once more, because of the gnawing of his conscience, Smerdyakov yesterday returned the money and then hanged himself. For had it not been the gnawings of his conscience, he would not have returned the money. And of course, only yesterday even did he for the first time confess his crime to Ivan Karamazov, as Ivan Karamazov has himself stated, for otherwise, why should he have remained silent about it until now? So then he confessed. But why? I shall again repeat. In his suicide note, did he not inform us of the whole truth, as he knew that for the guiltless defendant that the last judgment was at hand upon the morrow? After all, the money alone does not constitute a proof. There did, for example, a week ago become known to myself and 2 other persons in the chamber a certain fact, namely that Ivan Fyodorovich Karamazov had sent to the principal town of our province for an encashment 2 5% bonds, each with a value of 5,000, making up 10,000 rubles in total. I mention this fact merely in order to point out that money may come into anyone's hands on a given date, and that in bringing 3,000 to the court, it is impossible to prove beyond doubt that this money came from this or that drawer or envelope. And lastly, Ivan Karamazov, having yesterday received such an important communication from the true murderer, does absolutely nothing. But why did he not declare it at once? Why did he postpone it all until the morning? I believe I am entitled to speculate why. His health undermined the past week, having himself confessed to the doctor and those close to him that he has been seeing visions, encountering people who are dead. That's creepy. On the eve of the delirium tremens, which has struck him this very day. He, having suddenly learned from Smerdyakov's decease, suddenly constructs for himself the following argument. The man is dead. The guilt may be placed upon him, and I shall save my brother. After all, I have money. I shall take a wab, and say that Smerdyakov gave it to me before his death. He will say that this is dishonorable, that even though the man be dead, it is nonetheless dishonorable to slander him with lies, even in order to save one's brother. Yes, but what if he lied without being conscious of it? What if he himself, his reason affected by his news concerning the lackey's sudden death, imagined that such was in fact the case? After all, you saw the scene of earlier today. You saw what state this man was in. He stood on his feet and spoke, but where was his mind? That earlier testimony of a man in acute delirium was followed by a document, a letter from the defendant to Miss Verkovtseva, written by him 2 days before the enactment of the crime, with a detailed program of it drafted in advance. Well, and why do we seek this program and those who devised it? Word for word, according to this program, was the deed performed, and it was performed by none other than its deviser. Yes, gentlemen of the jury, it was performed as though out of a book. And in no wise did we run deferentially and fearfully from the paternal window, in the firm conviction, moreover, that our beloved was with him now. No. That is preposterous and improbable. He entered and put an end to the matter. It is probable that he killed in anger, a fire, with vicious hostility. No sooner did he set eyes upon the one who hated him, his rival, but having killed him, which he did, perhaps, with one blow, one stroke of his hand, I'm not going to say excuse me anymore because it sounds stupid, and I'm kind of drunk. With one blow, one stroke of his hand, armed with the brass pestle, and having satisfied himself after a detailed search that she was not there, nonetheless did not forget to put his hand under the pillow and obtain the money in the envelope, the torn shreds of which now lie here upon the table of material evidence. I say this in order that you shall observe a certain circumstance, in my view an exceedingly characteristic one. Were this an experienced murderer, and in particular a murderer whose aim was robbery alone, well, would he have left the empty envelope on the floor, in the aspect in which it was found beside the corpse? What I mean is that suppose it had been, for example, Smerdyakov committing the murder for the sake of robbery, why he would simply have carried off the whole envelope with him, in no wise taking the trouble to unseal it over the victim's corpse, for he knew of a certainty that the money was in the envelope. After all, it had been put there and sealed in his presence, and had he carried off the envelope altogether, would not the existence of a robbery have remained unknown? Dude, that was a question that's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines long. Shit, I don't know if you guys could follow. Anyhow, I'll continue. I ask, gentlemen of the jury, would Smerdyakov have acted thus? Would he have left the envelope upon the floor? No. The one who had acted thus would be a frenzied murderer, on whose reasoning was by this time poor. A murderer who was not a thief, and until then had never stolen anything, one who even now pulled the money out from under the bedding, not as a thief who was stealing, but as someone retrieving something that belonged to him from a thief who had stolen it. For precisely such were the ideas of Dmitri Karamazov concerning that 3,000 ideas which had attained within him the pitch of mania. And lo, having seized the envelope, which he has never seen before, he tears its cover in order to ascertain that the money is there, and then flees with the money in his pocket, even forgetting to think that he is leaving on the floor a most colossal accusation against himself in the form of the torn envelope. All because it is Karamazov, not Smerdyakov, has he not thought, has not considered, and indeed, how could he? He tries to run away, and hears the cry of Grigory, the manservant who is catching up with him. The manservant seizes him, stops him, and then sinks to the ground, felled by the brass pestle. The defendant leaps down to him out of pity. Imagine, he suddenly wants us to believe that he leapt down to him that night out of pity, out of compassion, in order to look and see if he could not assist him in some way. Well, was that a moment at which to display compassion of such a kind? No. He leapt down for the specific purpose of ascertaining whether the sole witness of his evil deed was alive. Whoa. And any other emotion, any other motive would have been unnatural. Observe that he takes pains over Grigory, wipes down his head with his handkerchief, and ascertaining that he is dead, runs off again, like a lost soul, covered in blood, back there, to the house of his beloved. Now, how is it? Okay, this is at the top of page 912. How is it he has not considered that he is covered in blood and will at once be unmasked? But the defendant himself assures us that he did not even pay heed to the fact that he was covered in blood. That may be allowed. That is very possible. That invariably happens to criminals at such moments. On the one hand, fiendish calculation, and on the other, an insufficient level of awareness. At that moment, however, he was thinking only of the whereabouts of her. He needed to learn, in haste, where she was, and now he runs to her lodgings, and discovers a piece of news that is of unexpected and most colossal importance to himself. She has travelled away to Mokroy with her beyond dispute.